I guess my starting point will be that point, the Apartheid Bubble. And that is that knowledge was produced in a bubble. It was not open to different fields of thought in different disciplines across the world. I think it speaks to what is necessary in the present, because who we are and the social identity markers influence the questions that we ask and the way that we talk about things. I mean, Africanization, obviously that one thinks of black, but this kind of inward lookingness and feeling that ideas from outside are a threat, this appeals to people who are white as well. And I feel like it also, it easily embraces mediocrity, because it embraces people whose views are like ourselves, not pushing outside of your own boundaries. And people on both sides of the spectrum can embrace this. They can embrace what they might see as the local at the expense of engaging with different sets of ideas that are out there. That is too close to how apartheid did its work. Steve Biko's religious background and his faith shaped the manner in which he engaged with black consciousness. Before his death, he was presenting himself as someone who would prefer to die rather than to be dishonored. And it's not just that he was an idealistic person who died in his at age 30, almost the same age of Jesus, in his crucifixion.
Good morning, Zanzi, and welcome to the Social Justice Lab, where it may seem like it's about a lot of things, but we assure you, it's just society. We're joined today by the man, the myth, the legend, Professor Christian Williams. Professor Christian Williams obtained his PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan. His research interests highlight anti-colonial struggles in Southern Africa and their aftermath. The central themes of his publications include nationalism, history, exile, refugees, camps, solidarity, and faith. One of his critically acclaimed publications, one of the more recent ones, is a historical ethnography of SWAPO's exile camps. Welcome to the Social Justice Lab, Professor Williams.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Okay, Professor Williams, I just want to, I know we touched on it a bit, but I just want to dive straight into the seminar on knowledge decolonization that you had at the UFS in 2017 and some of the insights you gathered there. I had the pleasure of reading the paper that reviews the ongoings, and I just want to start by speaking to this point that was addressed in the seminars, which is a lot of the times people tend to scoff at such interventions such as the Social Justice Lab on the basis of it's more talk. We're going to talk and what's the utility of this? And one of the points that were addressed in 2017 is that because the critique is mostly there's all talk, no action, and is that talk is a form of action. So I just want to start off by picking your mind here. What's the importance of discussing subjects such as decolonization and how does it speak to the audience members and their dreams?
So, as you just said, talk is a form of action. Talk leads to action. Talk informs action. I think university spaces are the spaces where we can deepen one of the spaces that we can deepen our talk. We can think more deeply about issues. And so I understand and I write about in that paper where some students might be coming from and saying, all talk, no action. But I feel like to have better action, to act more effectively in a social justice context, we need to talk better. And that's what universities are equipped, especially humanities faculties, are equipped to do. And so we tried in the context of a seminar that I was running with colleagues over 2 years to improve our talk. And the actions that come out of that are unique to every individual and how they're placed in society and how they imagine what they can do from their standpoint to make the society a better place.
An interesting point there on like university spaces, talking in university spaces particularly. One of the points that you addressed in the paper is that classically certain Afrikaans universities were closed off from discourse, and a lot of the suppositions that these people harbored were unchallenged for a long time, both internationally and domestically. It was a homogeneous learning environment. Please touch on some of the long-term effects of that.
Yeah. So to contextualize, I feel like the conversation around decolonization in universities in South Africa has been dominated by a few elite universities and not recognizing the different colonial legacies at different universities. And, at the UFS and other Afrikaans medium universities, I think their legacy, although it overlaps in some ways with the UCTs and the Rhodes or the Fortairs and the UWCs, in some ways it's unique. And I think what is especially strong at those Afrikaans universities is they were very inbred. I mean, maybe we should start with the basics. Those universities were apartheid supporting overtly, but they were also very inbred environments, because effectively from the middle of the 20th century in the humanities, ideas were moving in one direction and in another direction globally, a direction which was opposed to apartheid thinking. And at those universities, they were reinforcing apartheid thinking, and those global ideas were threatening at those institutions. And so for the disciplines to exist there, they had to close themselves off from those global conversations. And Afrikaans medium instruction became a way of closing oneself off. People could create whole careers and just publish in Afrikaans and not engage with English language literature from all over the world. So I think that's created a legacy, and so many things have changed since then. I don't mean to imply that things haven't changed since 1994, but when people are trained in that kind of environment, you need exposure from somewhere else to break out of what I would call the apartheid bubble. And part of what we were trying to do and think through in that seminar was how to break through this apartheid bubble, even with colleagues who are critical of that past, very critical of it, but may have been exposed in their disciplines to mentors who were only trained in that bubble. Yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of the time the universities or higher learning institutions, to broaden the scope, were involved in promoting apartheid, like you said, right? What role do higher learning institutions play in instilling social values post-colonialism? And how effective were they in instilling those apartheid ideas during apartheid?
Okay, so you're asking about post-colonialism, instilling values, and then the apartheid era as well.
Just starting from the apartheid era, right?
Yeah.
How effective were higher learning institutions in instilling certain ideas? And post-colonialism, what role can they play?
Yeah, I mean, I think those universities were very effective in instilling apartheid values, though the histories are different at different places. I think when one focuses on, say, a place like University of Cape Town or a Rhodes University, one looks at the contradictions between what their ideals were and how they hired people, or what kinds of critical thinking they promoted. But they were, at an idea level, they were opposed, ideologically in many ways to apartheid. They may have aligned themselves in all kinds of ways with the political order. But at a place like UFS, ideologically, it was aligned with apartheid. I mean, I would argue, and this is a provocative statement, but at least in the humanities, I would argue that the UFS was not, in fact, a university until after 1994. To me, a university has to have a degree of openness to ideas and exchange that was simply not permissible. You could not have a career, at least in the humanities. The sciences and other fields, although they are also impacted by apartheid, it's different. But in the humanities, I don't think it even qualified as a university. It became so inbred, so ideologically driven that it wasn't a university space. And so now in the, the post-apartheid, the post-colonial creates the chance for opening that up and instilling a whole new set of values. And of course, UFS, like other institutions, have opened their doors to so many students. But what you have now, and you've had now for years, is a predominantly black university, but in which the institutional values are still heavily shaped, or were significantly shaped by a previous era. So it's it's a place of there's a lot of work to be done to shift those universities from inside to make them as appropriate as they can be for the post-apartheid. The other way of reflecting on your question is, universities are largely safe spaces for ideas. So even where one might think that the way things is done is backwards or is apartheid reinforcing, there is actually a lot of scope for talking about things differently. I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons that so much of the, the violence and the protests took place in a university context. It has taken place in a university context, not just in the fees must fall or roads must fall movements. It's not just that students were leading them, but they were relatively safe spaces, despite the problems with security guards, and I think there were relatively safe spaces for students to express their ideas and talk, and I think that is part of why they are such significant spaces for rethinking the apartheid legacy.
Yeah, so it's sort of like the tools that dismantled can also double as the tools that build.
Absolutely.
And speaking to that, what are some of the more interesting aspects that you sort of spoke on some of them a bit, and I want you to unpack them in the paper, of the colonial character of South African universities that were highlighted in the 2015-2016 protests?
So, yes, as I was, I guess my starting point will be that point, the apartheid bubble, and that is that knowledge was produced in a bubble. It was not open to all kinds of different fields of thought in different disciplines across the world. And I think that is so crucial. And I think it speaks to what is necessary in the present, because yes, who we are and our social identity markers influence the questions that we ask and the way that we talk about things. But more than anything else, I feel like apartheid-era institutions, and especially those Afrikaans institutions, need to break outside of their bubbles. And it's not as simple as black or white, male or female, this ethnic group or that ethnic group. Exposure to broad flows of knowledge, recognizing that the knowledge and the people who are thinking critically about how to promote social justice in Africa are people of all different skin colors. There are people who are born on the continent. There are people who are based in Europe. There are people who are based in North America. There are people who are based in other parts of the world. And the ones who are pushing the conversation forward are part of a global conversation. They're not just locked into the one narrow stream in which they have been trained. And that, to me, is a crucial point.
It reminds me of your critique of the native approach to decolonization, which is let's discard everything that is not, seen as African, not perceived as African, and replace that with Africanism, and push sort of that Africanization of knowledge, as you put it. Can you please expound on your critiques of that approach?
Yeah, I mean, the language of Africanization can mean very different things and from different people's perspectives. I can be in support of it or against it, depending on what one is actually saying. But one of the in my opinion, negative forms that this took in the midst of the 2015-2016 protests is it became very inward looking. It became very navel gazing. It became a way of dismissing the viewpoints of anyone who is not exactly like myself. And to me, there's a great irony in this, because this is exactly what apartheid did. This is apartheid logic to a T. It's and to use another language for this, it's essentializing identities. It's saying that there are only certain people who can speak on behalf of my culture, however that's defined, racially, ethnically, etc. And there's no one else who has anything of value to say to that. That's exactly the logic of the apartheid regime with respect to culture, and that is the logic of some versions of Africanization. And it just reiterates the apartheid stance. And to me, there's a great irony of it, in that there are people on both sides of the political spectrum in South Africa, of both, if we present South Africa in terms of whiteness and blackness, people on both sides for whom that will be appealing, right? I mean, Africanization, obviously, one thinks of black immediately, but this kind of inward lookingness and feeling that ideas from outside are a threat, this appeals to people who are white, of course, as well. And I feel like it also, it easily embraces mediocrity, because it embraces people whose views are like ourselves, not pushing outside of your own boundaries. And people on both sides of the spectrum can embrace this. They can embrace what they might see as the local, at the expense of engaging with different sets of ideas that are out there. That is too close to how apartheid did its work. Even if apartheid's work was to specifically stigmatize blackness, it's very similar.
So basically, your critique centers on a lot of the negative, the more, let's say, harmful aspects, of Africa. This native approach to decolonization of Africa is that it is conceived from the very system that was oppressive towards the very group that's trying to promote it.
Yes, I think we could talk a lot about what things have changed since 1994 in South Africa or in Southern Africa, and what things remain the same. But I think it's viewpoints and identities which are dying hard. And laws have changed, and those changes have made huge differences in many people's lives. But the sense of allegiances to particular identities, and the ideas around who should be talking about what, who is authorized to talk about what, that is very strong, and it repeatedly dismisses, it shoots people down, from being able to have dialogue. And people need to have dialogue across difference. That's what apartheid was, hell-bent on undermining, and that's, in my opinion, what a university in a post-apartheid South Africa needs to generate.
Okay, Professor, I just want you to just explain something to our audience here before we go into this. I could explain it, but I think my explanation would be limited. The concept of cultural mixing through by the means of diffusion, right? So there are distinct forms of diffusion, namely things like what I can think of my head, indirect diffusion, where people, where ideas are spread indirectly, right? It's a pretty thing. And then there's also like forced diffusion, right? Can you please just tell us, like explain what diffusion is for the audience first, and then tell us, is there a tangible legacy of forced diffusion in South Africa? If so, how do we gauge the diffusion's destructive or desirable quality, given the diversity of interests within our society?
Yeah. So diffusion refers to the way that culture moves across people and across space. There's from the 19th century, anthropologists were writing about something called diffusionism, how some anthropologists were interested in this. So in the present, one of the arguments that I would make, and many anthropologists make, is that it's problematic to think about any culture as distinct, because as much as we can explain a lot about different groups of people through talking about difference and different values and norms that a set of people has versus another set. Ideas flow across, and also boundaries are blurry. So I mean, what is a South African? I mean, you can define it as who has a South African ID, or we can define it as who has a shared sense of certain cultural boundaries in the society, about who belongs to which group, people who have this shared sense of what the boundaries are in the society. They may be South African citizens, they may not be South African citizens. There's so many people who have spent a lot of time in South Africa who have been enculturated to South Africa, and they have moved across space, and they have these ideas. At the same time, there are ideas in South Africa, and that South Africans have it, which they have flowed across space. They're not take gospel music, take hip hop music, right? I mean, these are cultural forms which are vibrant in South Africa, and we could talk about maybe South African styles of singing or performing, or acting those forms, but they're not distinct to South Africa. They've been part of, these are flows of ideas that have, a lot of this is a flow between the United States and South Africa, but of course those flows are global, they're broader than that. Now you mentioned, I think, forced diffusionism or forced diffusion, and I think, now we're talking about that sort of suggests a colonial past and the way that certain cultural ideas and values were imposed on people, and the way that people had to were pushed into losing aspects of who they are, or adopting aspects through they are, and in the context of violence, this of course is also part of the history of diffusion. I think any idea, and you'll tell me if I'm addressing all that you were thinking about with the question, but the idea that anyone can go back to a past prior to the violence of colonialism is misplaced. I mean, you can learn about the people and what it was like for your ancestors before the violence of colonialism, but who we are, how we understand ourselves to be as people living in South Africa, Southern Africa today, is part and parcel of that violent past. And people have to make choices about what they want to see for their future, and think about, in my opinion, think about culture as a resource to create futures that we want to create, not to try to go back to some past that we imagined before forced diffusion and think that that can be reconstructed and that people can live that way today. I don't think that's actually what most people are even looking for today, even if that kind of discourse is sometimes used in political life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, so basically, what you're saying is, in terms of forced diffusion and some of the more ethnocentric, and for our viewers here, ethnocentrism refers to sort of cultural importance, putting your culture at the center of all human life. So these ideas, although they may have come into contact with our culture and you know our culture, they are now so deeply entrenched in us that it would be misguided and perhaps even harmful to act in resistance of them just for the sake of resisting them, as opposed to actually analyzing an idea and thinking about where it comes from. Because I remember one of the points you made is an idea itself, where an idea comes from is maybe as important as the idea itself, right?
Yes.
So these things are in us. There's no use fighting them, but there is some utility in realizing where they come from and perhaps, you know, forming a path to the future where we take what we need and we dispel what we don't need.
If you're conscious of that, where these ideas come from, that's part of, in my opinion, the empowerment to now decide what future you want to make with them. Otherwise, we just become, we are beholden to the identities that and the ideas about culture that we have inherited, rather than agents in shaping the new. I mean, and when you say our culture, any way that one thinks about our in South Africa today is somehow, I would argue, embedded in the colonial past. Is when you think of your culture for yourself, whether you use the term Sutu, you use the term Afrikaner, Zulu, you use the term black, white, Indian, colored, those categories and the associations with those categories have been shaped through colonial history. So there's no way out of the colonial origins of the identities themselves, of the sense about what our culture is. Even South Africa itself, you can't talk about South African culture 500 years ago because South Africa as such didn't exist. One can talk about what was going on culturally in this place we call South Africa, but it was South Africa as an hour for our culture didn't exist. So I would argue, I mean, studying those pasts, I think it's really important to study the pre-colonial. I think I very much value that, but it's not to come to some essential idea about who I am now through studying that. It is gaining understanding of a deeper past, seeing what colonialism did to it and forced diffusion did, and then deciding what value, how you want to work with that inheritance today, rather than be beholden to what some cultural authority says it means to be a Sutu, Afrikaner, white, black, South African, etc. People need to decide that now.
That's a very significant point, and it sort of hits a nerve in me of something I read from one of my favorite authors, Robert Greene, where he talks about, in the Laws of Human Nature, he talks about like groups and how we sort of form groups and we crave group identity and identification with the group, to the point where we not only take ideas because we're in a group, but sometimes we'll even take on ideas so that we can be in the certain group. And what he sort of, his resolution to this is that we should, okay, fine, there are sort of smaller groups and factions that are, probably gonna occur, but as students of human nature, we should observe that, we should realize that the real group here is the human race. You know, that's the reality group, is the whole of the human race. And I think that's what you're discussing here with the cultural fluidity.
Yeah, cultural fluidity is a good word for it. Yeah. Yeah, the real group is the human race. That's the group. I mean, if we're talking social justice, we're talking, in my opinion, about how to be human, how to learn to be truly human and figure out how to engage with each other in ways where our first point of reference is our shared humanity.
Yeah, that's that's a very, like a lot of the things that you discussed here, that we've discussed here, are very significant, and I feel like we started here by saying that action, talking is a form of action, and I feel like a lot of the insights that you've provided here have the capacity to shape people, the audience's mind, and orient them toward more progressive ideals about the world, ideas about the world.
I hope so. I think so. And I think, to go on a slight tangent there, you mentioned anthropology, right? That's my field. And sometimes people ask, what can you do with a degree in anthropology? Well, any kind of work that you might do which you would like to see move towards social justice, that's what anthropology trains you to do. It trains you to, it pushes, it deepens your critical thinking and your voice. And, employers across, many different sectors appreciate people who can think deeply about how to make things more humane. So I think that's what anthropology is supposed to be doing in the world, and it's also, more broadly, what the humanities are supposed to be doing. I think sometimes, students enter university thinking, well, humanities, what can I do with this? Well, anything which is about making society more justice-focused or more progressive, a humanities education is exactly what should be, leading you there. I would like to see South Africa's universities, make the humanities more central as they are. Humanities are under threat, everywhere in the world to some extent, but central to what everyone. Our lawyers, our doctors, they need to be trained in the humanities just as much as as others do, because social justice values and being progressive is just as relevant for them, in their fields, as for someone who studies English or history or anthropology. That's my view.
I think there's a lot to consider there from our audience. I just want to take it back to the region here, like a story of the broader region. And please just tell us the story of I feel like this is not talked about a lot at all, and we've touched on this in the social justice lab in the past, but I feel like now you're the perfect person to now expand our understanding of this. Please just draw a brief picture of how Namibia came to fall under South African apartheid colonial rule, and what the thinking was there.
Yes, so Namibia was a South African colony from 1919 to 1990. It was a German colony previously, but after the First World War, it was a League of Nations mandate, and that mandate was given to South Africa to administer. And after the end of the Second World War, of course, the League of Nations disbanded and the United Nations was formed. And the idea was that League of Nations mandates should be moved towards independence. But the South African government did not want to move Namibia, now Namibia, then Southwest Africa, towards independence. It argued that Southwest Africa should be incorporated into South Africa as its fifth province. And so they effectively moved against the whole inertia of international law to try to make that happen. Eventually, they stepped back from that position, which is why Namibia is not part of South Africa today. but they did hold on to Namibia from that moment through 1990, and that's really the context for Namibia's liberation struggle. From the start, there are many parallels, but from the start, that struggle was fought at the UN because nationalists, anti-colonial nationalists in Namibia said, there's no basis in international law for South Africa to be governing us under this apartheid system, which of course they were opposed to. And they hoped that the international community was going to intervene, and their independence was going to come in the 1960s already, when so much of the continent became independent. But in 1966, the International Court of Justice ruled that it couldn't rule on the case, and then and that's when the armed struggle started in Namibia. And even when the UN eventually turned on that, and the International Court turned on that, the South African government wasn't willing to step back from its position for a long time. There's some other chapters in the interim which we could talk about if listeners are interested, but that in short is the context.
Yeah. And in terms of the other chapters, I wanted to speak specifically, and just to start off, I think that just set the context for Namibia and for our audience to understand the dynamics that ensued there. But I just want to you to just take us on a journey of the interplay between struggle liberation politics and the struggle liberation movements and faith.
Oh, so many freedom fighters across the region were shaped by religious backgrounds and have faith lives. I mean, I think at that level, it's a fairly obvious statement to make for anyone who is aware of these histories. Certainly, South African listeners, viewers will know this is the case in South African history. You don't have to. You can just think about Albert Lutuli or Desmond Tutu or many others, but they come across, of course, as very prominent figures of faith in South African history. But of course, this is not just true in South Africa. This is true elsewhere in the region as well. And one of I've just written a book on this topic. Hopefully, will come out next year. And one of my arguments in that book is that often the way this has been discussed in Southern Africa has focused on institutional religion, which is very important. I mean, we can have a whole discussion about where the churches and church leaders stood in favor of colonialism and where they opposed colonialism, favor of apartheid, or where they opposed it. But at the level of faith, at the level of internal experience of religion and identity, that plays out. There are many people who become, prominent freedom fighters who, they might not have been church leaders. They might not have even been seen by many around them as conventional adherents to their religion, but their faith lives are shaping how they are engaging with, the anti-colonial struggle and what they're prepared to do. There was just a blog this week by Jacob Lamini on Steve Biko. Jacob Lamini is a historian of South African himself. And what does he write about? He writes about the extent to which Steve Biko's religious background and his faith shaped the manner in which he engaged with Black consciousness, and the way that he before his death, he was presenting himself as someone who would prefer to die rather than to be dishonored. And that was very, it's not just that he was an idealistic person who died in at age 30, almost the same age of Jesus, in his crucifixion. I mean, he saw himself as on a mission to create a more human South Africa, and he saw his own death in the light of the Jesus story. There is a profound life of faith, despite the fact that Biko is often remembered more for his powerful critique of white missionaries and the church. But if you look into Biko and his writings and his thinking, you can't miss the faith life which is there, whether he's part of the institutional church at various stages in his life or not. Faith is there.
I remember like there's this publication by Professor Jared McDonald. He's a historian. He wrote about the Khoisan in the 19th century, that they were the British. There was sort of a civilian-driven violence that was prevalent in the Capes, right? So there was a discourse, right, between groups about where the British were looking for labor so that they can, advance the colonial industrial agenda, whereas the Afrikaner or Dutch settlers and farmers would go on, occasional killing sprees, killing Khoisan and other natives due to their goal of land expansion, which sort of on some level conflicts with the one of getting labor. So to come back to this point of faith, right? The humanitarians, the missionaries of the time, were advocating for teaching, the indigenous population how to read, the Khoisan, the San specifically, how to start to read so that they can read the Bible and become better colonial subjects. But the critique at the time, the prevailing critique from other people who sought to see other ends, was that, or even within the thing, was that if we teach these people how to read the Bible, that obviously opens them up to reading political texts, which ultimately usurp the colonial thing. So I think that's another interesting thing where faith intersects with.
Absolutely. This is the tension embedded in the mission encounter. On the one hand, many missionaries look down on African culture, and some missionaries' views could align even more directly with the ideas about identity that were used to divide people, conquer and rule. On the other hand, by many missionaries' ideas about the equality in Christ, not to mention just the skill. I mean, let's work on this on two levels. One, you just pointed to from, I think, Jared McDonald's work. Learning to read is an empowering skill, and opens people up to sets of ideas that might be threatening to the colonial regime. Moreover, that emphasis on learning to read is in part, at least, driven by the idea that to be Christian, you need to read the Bible, very strong in the Protestant tradition by any denomination, and from this, many came to the conclusion that if we are believers, then we are all equal in Christ. I mean, this is a language that Albert Lutuli was using against the colonial masters back then. And so whether the missionaries themselves, and of course there are missionaries who take radical pro-African views, and then there are missionaries that are quite reluctant to identify with any sort of anti-colonial struggle. But irrespective of what kind of missionary we're talking about, or those variations in the history, this was faith became linked for so many people, so many Africans, to notions of equality and legitimacy of anti-colonial critique. And so just because there's that missionary baggage does not mean that that's the baggage that, that may, it's also many refuse to allow how different church leaders spoke about faith, to define what faith meant for them. I mean, the Dutch Reformed Church had a theology that directly aligned with the apartheid regime. That didn't. That one doesn't even have to talk about anti-colonial activists. I mean, most people who identified as Christians in South Africa did not agree with the way that the Dutch Reformed Church understood theology during the high apartheid era. They did not allow that form of Christianity to define what that meant, and likewise with faith generally. Just because the religious authorities define it a particular way, or a certain powerful authority, it doesn't, what's going on inside the person, what's going on in the key interpersonal relationships through which, political movements, build, that is not just controlled by what the church authority says.
The sort of the unintended consequences.
Indeed.
Wow. So you also mentioned the church, the Dutch Reformed Church, and I didn't think of that when I was sort of conceptualizing this conversation. And I think that is an interesting point about the Calvinist approach to, Christianity that the apartheid regime, the Dutch Reformed Church had, which, like, for our audience, Calvinism refers to seeing one's own identified group as the chosen of God, and anyone else is by consequence not equal, right? So it sort of conflicts with the thing of equal in Christ, the Calvinist take of the Dutch Review Church, the Dutch Reformed Church, and I think that also ties into the university thing that we touched on, and now it paints a broader picture of how social institutions play a role in how we view things and how idealize things, and in this climate where a lot of people are claiming that, and I don't want to be on either or side. I'm really a student in this regard, and sort of a social scientist observing things as objectively as possible, where things are sort of there's a moral relativism which refers to if things are right for me, then they're right, and which has led to a whole array of social phenomena that we can observe, and doing away with the old ways, sort of, so to speak. What do you make of the marriage between social institutions and ideas?
Social institutions obviously project ideas very powerfully, but their effects are much more complicated, and the way that ideas are shaped through them is much more complicated than what the authorities who run those institutions might think, or the way that we often think about them. Power doesn't work through a powerful institution running the world or organizing everything. Power works in much more diffuse and complicated ways. I mean, the church doesn't just, missionaries don't just come to Africa and impose a view which everyone suddenly adopts, and now they've all been brainwashed into being what the colonial missionary thought that Christianity should be, to continue with the specific Christian theme, which of course is so prominent in our region. People work with those ideas, and different things come out of them, and they work with them in different ways. I mean, in the context of religion, for quite some time, scholars tended to focus on the African independent churches, because it was, and especially in the context of critique of the colonial, because of course they make a break from the institutions. To return to your question, Africans create African institutions, but to think that those who remain within what are often called the mission churches, i.e. the churches that were established by the missionaries, are all just lock and step with what some missionary had to say about Christianity, and when he arrived here in the 19th century is very naive. To return to the Black consciousness theme for a second, I mean, most of those Black consciousness thinkers were went to mission schools, and most of them were in the mission churches. And I think anyone who looks seriously at their thinking will see the extent to which that exposure shaped who they are and their thinking. But obviously, they were arguing for something which was powerfully anti-colonial on that landscape, and was not it was shaped by the mission encounter, but it was refracted through their own experiences and their own sensibilities for what would bring social justice forward.
So basically, you could supply everyone with an exam pad and a pen, but they're not all going to draw the same picture.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So we're almost drawing to the end here, Prof. And again, Prof, I'm glad that we both agreed that Prof would be joining us again, because like there's a whole wealth of knowledge to traverse there. So I just want us to sort of return to the point of, disempowering ideas which stunt growth and stunt the cultural evolution of not only the region, but I think globally, these dynamics at play. So please bring to light the ways that colonial representation left a residue of ideas which not only shaped how others viewed Africa, but also how Africans view themselves.
Yeah, I'll again go back to that word identity. I mean, so many ways that we, living in the region, the way that people understand who we are, is shaped by the colonial encounter. And first, and that is to feel like you have to live out those identities the way that colonialism shaped them, is disempowering. At the same time, I don't think there's one way to engage with those identities. I'm not saying, Zulu identity is shaped through war and the now KZN and effectively empire building under Shaka. Does that mean that people should not identify as Zulu today? Because if you want to really be, and that was that context of those wars was during the colonial era. We can have a debate about to what extent the colonial regime shaped that. But does that mean that if you want to be decolonial, you need to somehow get back to some pre-Shaka understanding of what it of how to be culturally? I don't think so. But should you be beholden to what an authority says it means to be Zulu? I think that's disempowering, and we can say the same point for the Shaka example becomes a useful example because so much changed in that region in a short period of time with a very central figure that we all have as a frame of reference, probably. But that's true for any group. There are always any group. There are always cultural gatekeepers, authorities who speak on behalf of who we are and who we are supposed to be. And by all means, we can listen to that, but to be reduced to that and to think that is, especially if it's in the context of being anti-colonial, say that to be African is to be this. Who says that so-and-so is a coconut because they listen to classical music? Who says? Does that actually take anything forward? People need to figure out who they, who they are and who they want to be for themselves for a future in which we can all move towards justice and humanity, and be critical of cultural gatekeepers who often use the language of being anti-colonial or being African or being true to their roots, but in the process are actually undermining people's creativity to create, a world in which is more genuinely anti-colonial.
Yeah, so I think again, we're touching on the main, some of the main points, one of the main points of this discussion, which is the impermanence of culture, and an acknowledgement of the impermanence of culture. I think it's sort of been complicated by those aspects of the ethnocentric diffusion that come into play. So it's been complicated, especially in Africa, and complex in Africa, because of, on one hand, trying to outwardly, overtly resist some of these influences, and on the other hand, realizing that they've become ingrained in our society, and it's better to work within the system if you want to create genuine change.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. So in the interest of ending on a very giving the audience a takeaway, right? In post-colonial South Africa, or post-colonial Southern Africa, or post-colonial Africa, really, what are some of the ideas? Of course, we've already discussed here that we don't want to undermine people's ability to be creative and conceive some of these things on their own, or come to their own conclusions rather, and which is why I often advocate for teaching people how to think, as opposed to teaching people what to think, right? So how should we think? And I want you to sort of also draw on your experiences as an anthropologist and an expert on culture. But how should we think about African culture?
That is a big question. African culture is a resource that draws from the past and is focused towards creating the society that people who live on this continent want to make for the future. Everyone who is living in Africa and who is in the diaspora and who cares about Africa should be concerned about what African culture should mean for the now and for the future. And there are all kinds of and knowledge of the past, and sensibilities about how one's traditions link to those of others. That's that you can't do it without that knowledge. But that's culture is a resource. African culture is a resource. African culture is a storehouse of resources for the future. And African culture has been stigmatized through histories of colonialism and slavery, etc. But you don't just recover it by as if you get it. You take it off from the way it's been painted or disfigured by a colonial regime or by a racist, and then have it intact for yourself to take. Or you don't just get what your group or your group's authority says is your culture within African culture. It's a resource that you draw from and learn from to try to create the world that you would like to see for the future. And I hope that world that people who are African want to see for the future is one which is more equal and more humane. And there's obviously a tremendous amount of tradition and deeper, cultural legacies on the continent which can, draw us towards that. But it shouldn't be aimed at, trying to create some reclaim some whole from the past. It should be future directed. That's my thinking, anyway.
Yeah, no, that's very powerful. Thank you again for joining us, Professor Williams. I mean, I'm sure our audience is going to appreciate the depth which you answered the questions and sort of the thought that you've put into your work, before the interview and all the work that you've done to promote knowledge of, so the Southern African region. We really do appreciate your work, and we really appreciate you being here in the Social Justice Lab today.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
And thank you, Mzansi, for joining us here in the Social Justice Lab, where it may seem like it's about, a lot of things, but we assure you, it's just society.